And these are fascinating papers. Can everybody hear me? Raising very, very many interesting issues. I think that, of course, it took great pleasure in working on the Woolworth Building, but it's really a delight for me to see some other new and fresh ideas coming forward. I very much appreciated Kevin Murphy's situating this building being Gothic, and as you mentioned, it's at the very end of the so-called Gothic revival, I guess if we can cast in very broad and big terms in the U.S. Although in the 1920s there was a fabulous Gothic tradition, we can call it commercial Gothic, due in large part, I think, to the influence of the Woolworth Building in 1920s cities like Chicago, as well as Houston and San Francisco. During the 20s, we saw a number of beautiful commercial Gothic structures being built. The Russ Building in San Francisco is one of my favorite, which were inspired by the Woolworth Building. So this tradition did extend. But it was really interesting to hear Kevin Murphy speak about the very origins of the Gothic and ecclesiastical design, in even house design, and especially in Trinity Church in New York, where we see the first effort to be very authentic and serious about the structure of that church, so it's really true Gothic and not just a kind of pastiche carpenter Gothic. And so we see a kind of fascinating evolution in the Gothic, and Kimball is Francis Kimball, especially interesting character because you can see that he's involved in a range of types of Gothic, and he uses these for the first time in a major way in New York commercial construction, which is fascinating. So to have that context is wonderful, and one point from Kevin's talk that especially impressed me deeply, however, was that comparison with Notre Dame in Paris, and how Parisians must have viewed that cathedral at mid-century, and how important it was in the landscape of Paris, and just as a kind of symbol for the city itself and for the importance of the spiritual life in the city. And then how the Woolworth Building, in a sense, replaces that in New York, and they both have a strong associative power. They both have meaning for people via associations with the Gothic, and of course with Notre Dame. It's the true Gothic church, and all of that implies. In New York, it's something very different, and I would argue that some of the popular success of the Woolworth Building, because this is a skyscraper that was hugely, hugely popular in its day, widely photographed, widely published. It was fascinating to all kinds of people, to artists, to the person on the street. So it touched a broad spectrum of the population. Okay, so this wasn't just an elite architecture. It was an architecture that Gilbert's contemporaries appreciated, including Montgomery Schuyler, who we knew was a very rigorous critic and scholar, and had high standards, and Montgomery Schuyler appreciated the Woolworth Building, but people did. And so how and why did it have this power? And I think Kevin touched on that we are thinking, I think many of the people who are arriving in New York are coming fresh from Europe and the European tradition of cathedral building. It's got reminiscences with that tradition, with the cathedrals and with Europe that have importance for these new arrivals. But I think it goes even beyond that. And I think, so Kevin Murphy has opened up some very interesting questions here with regard to association. Before I leave this issue of the associative, power, meaning, people think of the Gothic and have associations with it, a particular kind. There's one thing I've discovered myself recently that I think is important, just from the standpoint of architectural criticism and the whole idea of, is the Woolworth Building, how do we describe it? Is it modern or medieval? Or certainly it's not 20th century avant-garde, we know that. But right around 1905, 1910, we have Claude Bragton, Bertram Goodhue, working in New York, and these are architects who are very interested in the Gothic tradition and in medievalism, and they began arguing, and this is the kind of first I've seen it in the discussions around the Gothic, that somehow in the architectural world today there are Goths, and these are original people. Architectural original. They've got an original, powerful, romantic imagination, and hence they're Goths. And then those classicists, well, they're more conservative and staid and kind of, well, just, they just don't have that romantic, wild imagination. And that's what's going to lead us into an interesting future for architecture. And Goodhue, Bertram Goodhue, who goes on to design the Nebraska State Capitol, is especially making this argument quite strongly. And so I found that, I discovered this relatively recently, and I just found that all very, very interesting. I would like to move on to Mary Beth Bett's very interesting presentation of the wide range of things that Gilbert is looking at. And she really made it even especially clear to me, even after I've been in the Gilbert archives looking at all these things, that he is just drawing on a range of precedents. And I thought her points about the precedent suiting the purpose of the building, and also, and then it could be a very specific purpose, like a particular Episcopalian church drawing on English Gothic and so on. I know that this is really critical for Gilbert, and some of his, for instance, what we know as the more modern designs, say the U.S. Army terminal out in Brooklyn, that, he said, it's an Army supply base, and so it's modern, and so we're going to make it look like a modern industrial, a building, and we're going to use concrete, and of course he develops this architecture that's very styler and flat. But one thing it's important to keep in mind is that this is a man who's a Beaux-Arts architect. He understands composition. So I know those of you who have seen that Brooklyn Army terminal know that it's very well proportioned, very elegant, very monumental, at the same time abstracted in a styler, and modern in a kind of classic sense. And so he's very interested in using what he understands of precedent, modern, medieval, classical, whatever it might be, to convey a particular image or identity for a client or for a building. And he's thinking about all this very carefully. And just one last observation of my own in relation to this. This is something that was very important in the École des Beaux-Arts. You'd go to study in Paris at the École des Beaux-Arts, and you were taught principles of composition. Style was something that you would choose as a kind of clothing. The word was often used for the composition. So composition is one thing, and style can be another. And I think Gilbert understood that better than, or actually he utilized it or exploited that notion, I should say, better than many Beaux-Arts architects. Joanna Merwood's talk was fascinating to me as well. I think mostly because she's drawing out the different theoretical and philosophical strands identified with the Gothic in New York and Chicago. And I think that this is, today, we could spend the rest of the day just among all of us, certainly the fine scholars we have here, discussing the theoretical content and the philosophical content of certain Gothic buildings and works by Viollet-le-Duc and John Ruskin and others who have very specific notions about the meanings of the Gothic, very specific philosophical notions. John Ruskin is quite different than Viollet-le-Duc. We know that, and I think Joanne was making this clear that Ruskin, who believed in truth in materials, and that there were moral implications around craft, that solid craftsmanship implied a happy medieval workman. These are full of social implications, these ideas of Ruskin, and I think had great importance in these burgeoning industrial metropolises faced with labor conflict in the 1870s and 1880s. By the later 19th century, Viollet-le-Duc takes on greater importance in Chicago, and I know that Cass Gilbert, in his education at MIT in the late 70s and travels in the early 80s, was exposed to both Ruskin and Viollet-le-Duc. But by the late 19th century in Chicago, Viollet-le-Duc is seen as the authoritative guide in thinking about how one is going to create a rational architecture based on this new material that we have, iron, and its proper handling in terms of what kind of envelope do we provide for it. It's iron encased in terracotta, and I think those ideas, which are articulated in, there's an essay of 1890 by William LeBaron-Jenny who describes just that thing. I think they are strongly indebted to Viollet-le-Duc. There are other European theorists, Gottfried Semper among them, but I think that Viollet-le-Duc really holds sway in Chicago at this time. Cass Gilbert is in the 1890s in St. Paul, on the edge of the debates and the discussion in Chicago, and he arrives in New York in 1898. His practice is moving ahead quickly in 1899 in New York because he has the Custom House Commission, and I know that he's keeping a glance, sort of a glancing, involvement with Chicago, and that's why we see him quoting Louis Sullivan in 1909 at West Point, insisting that Sullivan had it right, that the skyscraper is a modern type. Because it's modern, form follows function, and we need to express its verticality. And so that's what we see here in the Woolworth. And I feel I'm talking way too much already, and I can certainly have return to some of these issues. But I know that I would love to hear some response even to what I've said, or to if any of the speakers, Kevin or Mary Beth or Joanna, have something they want to add here. There is a lot to say about this. I would appreciate hearing from you. I know also I'm seeing in the audience some people who are incredibly well informed about this period in American architecture, so I would appreciate questions from you as well. But first, I would just like to hear if any of our speakers has a new issue to introduce or something to add.